Well, hello. Good evening, everyone. My name is Murray Foster from Toronto Songwriting School. Thank you for joining us. I think it's going to be a really good night tonight. This is the Business of Music series by the Toronto Songwriting School, where we about once a month have guests in to talk about the business of music, to further educate you, the listener, the viewer, in terms of how to navigate the music industry in Canada and internationally. Tonight we have Alastair Moock, a much awarded family music performer. I think he'll have a lot to say on a lot of topics, including family music and issues stemming from that. For everyone who's watching, we will at the end take questions in the comments section. So at any point during the show, if you have a question you want answered, throw it up in the comments section, and we will get to it certainly before the end of the broadcast tonight. So, without further ado, let's bring the amazing Alastair Moock on screen, as if by magic. Alastair, how are you?
I'm great.
Excellent.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, from what I understand, you're in just outside Boston right now.
Correct.
Is this true? Yes.
Yes.
Long time home?
Yeah, long time home. I grew up in New York, but I've been in Boston my whole adult life, my whole career, music career life.
Yeah. Boston, a folk hotbed.
It is. Yeah, singer-songwriter hotbed for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
I kind of stumbled into that when I came here. I came here after college not really knowing anything about Boston or the contemporary folk music scene, but it ended up being a great spot for me to kind of figure it all out.
Yeah. When I was doing the circuit that you were very familiar with, the folk music circuit across North America, Falcon Ridge, those places. Boston, even then in the '90s, was like so many artists were based out of Boston, folk artists. So I think it's for a long time it's been maybe the number one sort of folk hotbed of America. I dare say.
Yeah, and for me, like right out of the bat, coming from more sort of a traditional background, kind of heroes or Woody Guthrie, Leadbelly, Mississippi John Hurt. I, especially arriving here in the kind of the mid '90s, I felt a little out of step with the central thrust of what the folk scene here was like, and at times that felt, like I was in the wrong place. But in I think in the long run, it served me well because I was doing something that was a little bit different from what was kind of the norm in these
Hmm.
parts. But I mean, it's an incredible group of musicians to have available to play music with, to be in bands with, to learn songwriting from. So yeah, I think I was a grumpy young man who's come to appreciate my community a whole lot more over the years.
Are you still grumpy?
I am. Yeah, I'm grumpy, but I try to channel it towards good.
I love it. That's a great answer. Very honest answer. Let me run through your bio quickly so that the viewer at home knows who you are. Alastair Moock, in person on SteamYard. Released your first album in 1997. It says one of your formative. It says on Wikipedia one of your formative musical experiences was seeing Pete Seeger and Arlo Guthrie perform live as a kid. I think that sort of social justice angle. I'm sure we're going to deal with and get into over the
Mm.
next hour. By the early 2000s, was a folk circuit regular on that folk circuit that I know very well: Falcon Ridge, Newport Folk Festival, the Birchmere, a bunch of European tours, and then in 2010 turned to writing family music, and is now very much awarded, including a Grammy nomination and a gold medal from the Parents' Choice Foundation, which sounds very auspicious, I have to say. If I was going to pick, imagine the name of an organization that sounded auspicious, it would be the Parents' Choice Foundation. Sounds like the real thing.
It does. It sounds like it. Um, yeah, I mean, we'll get into this some. When I started exploring the waters of children's music after 10 years of being, an adult singer-songwriter, for lack of a better word. Um, it was very much like starting over in a lot of ways. Um, and there was a lot of, in some ways, prizes and awards and things mean more in children's music, because very few people will go buy an album of somebody they don't know anything about, in most genres, but in children's music they will, because it's, the business of children's music is that the music is often a gift, right, from a parent to a child, or from a teacher to their classroom, or so those awards carry more weight. And of course, I wanted that stuff, like we all do. We want shiny objects. I look at a lot of that now differently, because I've seen some of the corrosive aspects of what some of that does to our scene. But that's the business of music, is we get into this to create art, whatever it is that we do, and then we find ourselves in a business. And business and art are, they're not easy bedfellows. But I think, I guess with children's music, that kind of comes to the fore more strongly, because there is something specific about writing for kids, performing for kids. By its nature, you're engaged in an education process. It requires some goodwill and good intention if you're going to be worth your salt at all in it, and that makes the business part of it extra tricky to navigate. So, yeah, we can talk more as we go tonight, but it's been a year of upheaval and big changes in children's music, which I think are very, very positive. And I'm glad to have been a small part of some of those. But the scene's starting to look very different than it has, and I think that's a great thing.
Before we jump into that, do you want to play a song, and
Yeah.
people can, get a sense of stuff, of you?
A sense of stuff? Yeah, sure. I put out an album this past year called Be a Pain. It's an album about, about activism and the history of social justice and getting involved. And this is one of the songs from that album. Two little eyes staring from a crib, a tiny little mouth drooling on a bib, a tiny little fist with a tiny little grip. Before they grew up, everybody was a kid. Malcolm X was a kid, and Dr. King was a kid. Mahatma Gandhi was a kid. The Dalai Lama was a kid. Before they got tall, before they grew big, they used to be small. Everybody was a kid. You are a kid. You got dirt on your hands. You wipe them on your shirt. Yeah, you wipe them on your pants. But one of these days, you're gonna get real big. How do I know? 'Cause everybody was a kid. So where you gonna go? And what you gonna do? Who you gonna be? We're waiting on you. We're holding our breath, though we keep it well hid, because we all know everybody was a kid. Oprah Winfrey was a kid, and Angelina Jolie, even Bill Gates and Muhammad Ali. Before they got known, before we knew what they did, before they got grown, everybody was a kid. Two little eyes staring from a crib, a tiny little mouth drooling on a bib, a tiny little fist with a tiny little grip. Before they got known, everybody was a kid. Yeah, so where you gonna go? And what you gonna do? Who you gonna be? We're just waiting on you. We're biting our nails. Yes, we keep it well hid, because we all know everybody was a kid. I was a kid, and Murray was a kid too.
I'm still a kid. So there you go. I will
I think I hear a
applaud for
jazz chord in there somewhere.
yes. I saw you react to your jazz chord. I enjoyed it, but I thought, yeah, it was great. And you didn't seem at all grumpy.
No, it's one of the things that honestly playing for kids and families has helped is to bring out my better angels, I think. You know?
Right. Yeah.
My heroes were all grumps. You know, Pete Seeger was a grump, and Woody Guthrie was grumpy. And I think we undervalue grumpiness in our culture. It's you know, being Pollyannish doesn't serve society. So I would prefer to start with grumpiness and then figure out how can you serve from that point. But that's me.
Yeah. We need grumps. We need good grumps for sure. So let me ask you an epic question.
Okay.
You ready? So you sort of referred earlier to the current state of family music and the sort of upheaval of the last year. Can you trace for us the brief history of family music, where it came from, and what brought us to the current moment and what that current moment is?
That is epic. Well, tracing the history of family music, that is an interesting question. I mean, I think everyone's view of that is different, right? A pattern that I notice is that when people get into children's music, especially coming from another background, singer-songwriter, rock, or whatever, we often enter thinking that we're going to be the first people who are going to make sophisticated music for kids, and the first people who are going to speak to parents, not just kids. I certainly had that feeling, and I'm very anachronistic. So my like I've mentioned, my heroes, one of the things that they had in common, all of those guys, is that they wrote music for kids and adults. You know, John Hurt did, Leadbelly did, Elizabeth Cotten. I was a huge Taj Mahal fan growing up. He had a children's album. So I always had in the back of my mind that there was something about folk, blues, roots music that could lend itself to speaking to different audiences, and that kids would be part of that audience for me. Of course, when I jumped into the world of children's music, like everybody else, I learned quickly, oh man, there's a lot of actually really great stuff happening. I just haven't heard about it because we generally only hear what gets filtered through to us. So it's, you and I are reasonably within the same age range. And, it was Barney and a lot of stuff that, I've become more careful about naming some of that stuff. Some of the stuff's still around, but stuff that I would say doesn't speak up to children. There's also like I've also learned a lot. Some of that grumpiness that I came into this with, I realized like, oh, people do this for different ages. There is a place for writing stuff for very young children, and that's not really where my epicenter is. But that doesn't mean it's not important. Oh, and as I've seen people who are really good at it over the years, I've learned to value it a lot more. So it's an interesting genre because it's not defined by a style of music, right? It's the only style of music that's kind of defined by its audience, which is children. Um, and children come in not only all shades of color and background, but also in different sizes. There's little kids, and kids and families continue to sort of or can value music up to 10, 11, until we lose our kids to the teenage years when there's no getting them back. But that's still a big stretch of time to sort of think developmentally about what you're gearing your music towards, etc. So the upheaval that you're referring to is an upheaval that's happening across music right now and across our country, and I'm sure your country too, which is a racial reckoning with the past. You know, it's not the first time we've reckoned as a culture, but I think the confluence of the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter resurrection of that movement and it becoming more understood in white minds led to a real pivot moment in our culture and the Trump presidency here. And so I was part of a group last year in the wake of the murder of George Floyd that we all had a lot of ideas. I had some really bad ideas, like let's raise money for Black Lives Matter charities, and you know, sort of every white person in the group raised their hand. And after a while, some people had to point out, like, I'm not sure this serves what Black Lives Matter is about, is sort of handing a microphone to every white man with a guitar to put their brand on it. So if you're actually interested, let's have some conversations. And I was lucky to be part of a group that had those conversations, and it coalesced into a group called Family Music Forward, which is the first kind of racial equity group of its kind in children's music. And the group, it's been a real learning curve this year. We've done some great work. It's Black and Brown led throughout, and we created the first ever all Black music children's music festival online this past year, and then a second one of all Black women. And then the Grammys happened, and the Grammys is this like big iceberg that floats out in the water in small music genres especially, and children's music is as small as it gets. But there's access to the Grammys, which, like, I know in your band, did you get a whiff of the Grammys in your
No,
time?
no.
Neither does almost anybody I know in the singer-songwriter folk music world. Even, I mean, it's sort of, you have to be John Prine or Willie Nelson, you know, to get those, even in folk music. But in children's music, especially over the past 10 years when there have been some sort of technical changes within the Grammys, all of a sudden it was people like me, it was independent artists who were getting nominated. And I got nominated back in 2013. And then I got nominated again this year in 2020 for this album, Be a Pain. And I was one of 5 white nominees this year. 4 of them were male. All of them were sort of guitar strummers. And after a year of kind of realizing how much I didn't see, I didn't understand the ways some styles of music were just, you know, there's no ill will there. It's just a lack of familiarity, understanding. Hip hop especially stands out, but reggae, other styles of music that are sort of like, is that children's music? You know, it's not what we think of. And when I say we, I mean people who look like me, who have been the people in charge, because we are the ones who've been at every power juncture along the way. We're the booking agents, we're the publicists, we're the venue owners. And so we book what's familiar. And it's an interesting version of this because children's music is a very liberal, progressive group by its nature. And yet we've been making the same mistakes over and over again. And one of which, you know, at this highest amplified version is nominating overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male artists over and over again. So 3 of the 5 nominees this year declined our nominations after following the lead of Black and brown songwriters in our community who protested. And it's it's been an interesting year. There's been hurt feelings. It's been toxic in some ways, but there's been a lot of learning and growth on every side, including mine. Um, it's been very imperfect, but there has been a real kind of come to Jesus in children's music. So there are a lot more conversations happening now about what equity looks like, what access looks like, representation. And the really kind of amazing thing is that our little genre ended up rippling across. The Grammys this year have now announced some changes going forward that were directly related, not to our declining, but to this Family Music Forward protest, which is pretty empowering to know that like a small group in one of the smallest genres can actually have an effect. But it also speaks to the fact that the Grammys are now in a place where they are looking at this themselves, and they are trying to make changes too. So they're receptive to it, and that's really critical.
Yeah, that's
It's a
amazing.
very long answer.
Well, it was an
Sorry
epic
about that.
question.
Yeah, it was an epic question.
I warned you, and
You
you
did.
you stepped up to the plate, which was great. Um, and congrats, I should say, for I mean you earned a Grammy nomination at a moment where you were able to leverage that in a way that you believed in, and so like well done and congratulations for that. I mean that's uh that's you were the right man in the right moment, I think, for that, which
Well,
is great.
thanks. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm glad I wasn't alone. And I'm glad that like the community, despite some of the hard conversations and some of the difficult stuff, we really have rallied as a community. And that stems from the fact that, like I say, at its base, children's music really is made up of good folks. You know, there's nobody in our genre that's sort of saying, we don't care about diversity. You know, that stuff's stupid. Everybody cares about it. They really do. It's just, and I think that speaks to the larger picture of, you know, you can be well-meaning, you can be liberal, you can be progressive, and you can still fall into patterns that privilege white skin, you know, and all we have to do to perpetuate that is to not pay attention. Um, so this is a year that all of us in this genre paid attention, and things look different, and I'm hopeful about the future of the business, that it really will start to look different, that the power structure will start to change, that some of the big radio stations in children's music will hire more DJs of color, play more musicians of color, and that we'll see different results at the Grammys, among other things.
Hmm. It's amazing, and not a small decision to turn down a Grammy nomination. So, well done. That's big for sure. You spoke of family music, kids music, in terms of its educational properties, and
Mm.
it seems to me that more than most family entertainers, the nature of your education or what you're trying to put across is a moral education. Maybe you'll push back against that, but I think, in my perception, it seems like that's more of a focus, an overt focus in your music than other children's performers. There's obviously a moral element to children's music, but you're sort of forefronting that, I think, more than other artists. So, in your mind, what's the moral framework you want to put across? And are you conscious of that? Like, what are you thinking when you sit down to write a song?
Yeah, um, I guess, you know, I have, so some of it's personal and some of it is about learning this field, I think. So I have always had an educational bent, even with adults. Like, um, I've always wanted to talk about history. I'm very interested in storytelling. Um, you know, some of my adult music's writing songs about historical events, people like John Brown. Um, so for me, getting into children's music, it was, how do I maintain the same kind of interest, but switch who I'm talking to? And I struggled with that for a long time. Like a lot of people, you know, you get oftentimes the entry point to children's music is having children. Um, so I had my children in 2006. We had twins, my wife and I, and I made my first children's album a couple years later, and the subject matter was belly buttons, fishing, American history mixed in, cows. Um, but there was one song on there called Two Mommies, and it sort of reflected learning I had done at a school I had worked in, where I came to understand, as a straight cis guy, I didn't get this my whole life, that you could talk to kids about orientation, that wasn't talking to kids about sexuality. It was talking to kids about being who you are. And I had to learn that from other teachers. And then I reflected it in this song. And I remember a couple of reviews saying, like this album, this was an interesting track. Like, it seems to come out of nowhere. And they were right. It is sort of like fish, belly buttons, two mommies. I mean, maybe there's something to be said for not drawing attention to it. But, it took me a long time to figure out, how do you write about complicated issues with kids? And then the turning point for me in my life was the first really big year of upheaval in our personal life, was that one of our kids got cancer, had leukemia. And when she was in the hospital, we started to write songs together. And it really, besides everything, there are a million things I could say about what the personal experience was. But from learning from that creatively, what I learned was, first of all, I can't solve problems for children. This made me a much better songwriter in general, because my instinct when it came especially to political music, was, for adults too, was to solve problems. I realized that's...
By which you mean proposing solutions?
Yeah, proposing solutions. Mary's saying to turn up my volume a little bit. Hopefully that helps. Yeah, providing solutions. I came to realize that wasn't the role of the songwriter. If you're going to tackle political issues or complicated social issues, the role of the songwriter is to ask questions, to create dialogue. And it was clarifying for me with children, especially, that what I wanted to do was create plant seeds for conversations between kids and their adults, right? And that started for me really with that album that I made with my daughter when she was sick. And an example of this is that my daughter's twin, Elm, who uses they, them pronouns, so you know who I'm talking about. Elm was incredibly jealous of this experience. They were 5. The one sick child got all of this attention from parents, from all these well-meaning adults, and it was incredibly hard. And that was something I couldn't have known before, but it's something I saw and wanted to address and write this song for Elm. And I started to write a song about jealousy, and I realized that all my parental, but also my songwriting instincts, were to try to solve. Like, it'll be okay, you'll get your turn. And I realized not only could I not do it for my child, but I couldn't do it for the other children that were going to hear this album. But that didn't mean I couldn't write about it. It just meant I had to change my idea of what my role was. And so I ended up writing a song where the chorus is, "Have you ever been jealous?" And it's sort of a call and response. Have you ever been jealous? And let the kids on the recording really scream that out. And then, ba, 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 I know how you feel. And that was it. And that was a turning point for me in writing for kids, but also in writing in general. And the funny thing is that it took, I used to hate Mr. Rogers and all that stuff. And like all children's musicians, I've come to have great respect for Mr. Rogers. And I realized in that moment I was channeling, that was Mr. Rogers' magic, was recognize the feeling, acknowledge, accept, don't solve. That's not your role. And so that taught me, I feel like it changed all of the writing, because after that I started to do, and I don't think of it as moral writing or political writing, just I wanted to tackle complicated issues with kids. And so I made an album that was about gender and orientation, and then I made this more recent album that's about activism and stuff. And it took me a long time, especially with this one, to sort of find the road in. You have to find the right way to talk to kids about an issue. But I learned from that album in the hospital that there's almost nothing that's off the table with kids if you can find the right way in. And then when you do find the right way in, the goal is to create conversation, to plant seeds. You know, who are these names? Who is that guy, Malcolm X? Mom, Dad, who is that? You know, that's their conversation to have. And all I'm doing is saying, giving a little push, like, this is an important person. Let's talk about it. You know, creating a framework that everybody was a kid. You know, on that song, as I was thinking through this album, I was thinking about how we put heroes up on pedestals. All of us do. But how, especially to children, those pedestals must seem especially high, you know, and impossible to get up on. And I was thinking, if I was a kid, I'd want to know, how do you become Dr. King? How do you become Oprah Winfrey? And they were all kids. You know, they weren't formed from clay into these, what we've, you know, these saintly, they were people who made choices along the way. And it's their choices that we celebrate. And so that was sort of my in on that song, was, let's talk about when they were small.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you a businessy question, because this is the business of music. So let's change tacks a little bit.
Sure.
So I'm a songwriter who has decided to write family music, write for kids. And let's say I write a handful of songs. Maybe I record a handful of songs. What's the next step from a business perspective?
Well, I would say, well, backing up a couple of steps. And it's funny, I've had a bunch of these conversations this year with songwriters that are kind of starting out in this business. So my first piece of advice, and I wish I had given it to myself or I had known, is to do a lot of listening. I didn't listen to anybody. I was listening to people from the 30s and 40s, and then, you know, Free to Be You and Me. I stopped at the 70s, like made a hard stop. I wish I hadn't, because, you know, I figured it out eventually, but I wish I'd known how much good stuff there was out there. I wish I had had a better sense of the landscape and what people were writing about, so I could have had a sense of maybe where the gaps are. I've done a lot of talking this past year with a young, fairly young hip hop artist named Fuchs. And Fuchs has come into this scene relatively recently. He has a long background in jazz and hip hop, but he's come in to this national children's music scene recently, like with a laser focus on what's missing. And he brings a perspective I could never bring. He's a young black man. He wrote a song about Kwanzaa. He wrote a song about black women in history. But he's, and I hope I'm not oversharing, but, you know, he has really focused in a way that as a few years older, like, I don't know anything about YouTube analytics and blah, 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 but he's researched, like, what topics haven't been written about for kids? Where's the intersection of what I can bring, my expertise and life experience, and what isn't being done already? And he's had tremendous success with it. And I'm really impressed by that sort of coming into the space with that kind of focus. So I would advise anybody coming in to really pay attention. And I think it's one of the things why he's been successful, besides the fact that he's very talented, is that he's really paying attention to what other music's out there. What are people doing? What's it sound like? Where can I fit in? So that's a starting place. And you make your album, however that happens, and it's very different in different situations. So the next big question, and I've gotten this question for years and I grappled with it, is do I hire a publicist? Um, and I don't really know the answer to that question. Um, I know that it gets back to the issue of equity. It's a lot easier to be successful if you have money to start with because it's expensive to be a creative musician these days. Um, and it's cheaper in children's music than in some genres. I know, you know, there have been two or three, like that's it, publicists that have kind of sewn up the national independent children's music scene over the last 10, 15 years. And it's not easy to get them to represent you. Um, but if they do, it's a handful of grands of money. Whereas I know people in the sort of Americana folk world that really want to go for it, and it's like tens of thousands of dollars that they feel they need to pay a publicist. So in some ways, children's music is smaller, but that's still a huge expense to front. So if you have the means and you can kind of clear that bar, it helps for sure. But I guess the other side of that is that this is a relatively small scene. If you get in and you start paying attention to who the gatekeepers are, who runs the radio stations, who does this, you can do a lot for yourself. And I guess my advice is until you really know what you want, what you're trying to achieve, which is really, that's an important piece of it, is like, what do you want to achieve with this? You're going to spend a bunch of money. What are you hoping will happen? And that's a hard question to piece apart. It may seem obvious, but it rarely is. There's a lot of reasons we do this. Is it that you want to raise your profile? Is it that you want to sell a bunch of CDs? Is it that you want to break through certain barriers? Like, determine for yourself, what are my goals? I think that helps. And then I would say, see how much you can figure out by yourself first. My very first album that I made in this world, I didn't have a publicist. I did it by myself. And I was able to get it to a lot of the radio people in this world. It's a relatively small community. They played it. I didn't see any royalty money. I didn't make lots of money. I didn't even think about applying for the Grammys or any of that kind of stuff. But I started to get to know the community. And when I put out my next album, I knew a lot more people. And that time I was able to get a publicist. And I had a lot more sense now of why I might want to have a publicist and what the goal was. So I don't know. I think it's a very personal decision, and that's what's hard about it, is that there's no one size fits all. We come to this with different a lot of people can't even afford to make that really polished studio album. So if you can't, what can you do at home that can really showcase what you do well? And can that be a stepping stone to another project that maybe you can get some more money behind? You could do a fundraiser with your audience. You can get the money you need to create, but spend that money wisely, because most of us don't have money to just throw around.
Mm-hmm. Talk a bit about venues in terms of the business side of things. What are the first venues someone would play? How do you get booked there? Do you need an agent? What does that look like?
It's similar. One of the things about children's music is that it can be much more local than a lot of genres of music. Families don't tend to travel real far for stuff. So whereas your band, when you were traveling the country, I'm sure had to move from one major city to the next, constantly on the move. I can do a lot of work here in the Northeast and in different spaces. So I do play the clubs, I play the theaters, but I also spend a lot of time in schools. And so that's specific to my business model, in that I created these programs, like educational history programs that I do for kids in schools with older kids, elementary through middle school. But I know a lot of people in children's music who do different versions of that. They may do teaching on the side. They may do performances in preschools or whatever. And there's a lot of them. There's a lot of schools. So you don't have to travel as far necessarily. Um, there are the bigger festivals around the country. Of course, the last year and a half, none of us have been able to do that. But, there are things out there. There's the big museums around, some of which will fly you across the country when you get to that point. And um, I think one thing that's consistent across music is that there's a lot less, uh, you know, bling bling than there used to be. And that flying you around the country stuff happens a lot less.
Hmm.
So get used to having a nice van, um, figure it out. I will say that I think one of the benefits of children's music is that you can find a lot more work locally, and there's a weird sort of social value put on children's music that isn't put on the rest of music, although it should be. So there's sort of an understanding that children's music serves a social function, right? So you have, not only venues, but you have, depending on the ages that you're serving, but you have toy stores, you have, family centers, you have all these groups that realize that music's important for kids, will hire people to come in and do that. And you can find a lot of that work. And I know a lot of people who don't travel at all, but make, very decent money staying local to Boston and having regular gigs. They play every week at a couple of different like local venues, and um, yeah.
Just for a bit of clarity, if I want to play a school, do I call the school? I know in Canada there are organizations that book school shows, right? And I think they have conferences where you can perform and audition for them,
Mm,
and then get on their roster.
right.
But if I'm just starting out, do I call my local school? What's that mechanism?
So this is another thing that I think is very local. Here, we're in the northeast of the U.S. There is kind of um, and like every one of these things I'm talking about, it's complicated and there's a lot of layers to it. But in the suburbs, especially, there's kind of a culture of enrichment programs, which existed when I was a kid and still exists. But I've talked to a lot of people around the country, and it's not the same everywhere. So it's very specific to your region. There are a lot of enrichment programs that happen around here. So there's sort of an understanding that that's important and it serves a purpose. So that's a starting place. That helps. Um, when I started looking into performing for schools, I put together a program um, based on what I thought I knew about, which was Woody Guthrie. So I had sort of Woody's life story, mix of narration and music. I thought it was pretty good. It didn't occur to me that Woody Guthrie is like barely in the curriculum in high school, let alone in elementary school, and that the Great Depression and the labor rights movement doesn't really get taught till high school, which is when enrichment programs stop. So it wasn't a good fit. Um, and I thought, what do I do? A couple of schools pushed me. Can you expand this program to talk about civil rights, etc.? And I hesitated on that a lot because I didn't think I knew enough about it or that it was my place to teach about it. Um, but I started to do a bunch of reading. I posted recently. I wrote a first draft of a program that I created called Music and Social Change. And a friend of mine who I'm now doing a lot of work with, Reggie Harris, who's older than me, um, told me I should send it to Pete Seeger because he played a big part in the narrative. And I thought, well, that's ridiculous. Um, and I asked him, so, like, will you write me a letter of introduction or like how? He's like, no, no. Here's his address. Send it to him in Beacon, New York, at this PO box. I guarantee you, he'll write you back. So I sent it off like into the ether, and within a week, I got a letter back from Pete, marked up in red pen. It was like, wrong. This is wrong. You need to go read this book. Don't give me credit for We Shall Overcome. It's Guy Carawan. All of this stuff, right? It kind of knocked me over the head, but it also gave me a good kick in the ass that I needed, along with the schools, to do a lot more reading. And I started to piece together a narrative that made sense, that I felt like I could tell from inside my skin, that was honest, and it started to develop. But my next move was there was a local roster, like you said. Here in Massachusetts, there's a group called Young Audiences of Massachusetts. And I went and saw a showcase of what they were doing, and their performers blew me away. And I thought, I want to be part of that. And at first, they didn't accept me. I kept working at it. Eventually, they did. They helped me
Because
get
of your
my.
content?
Yeah, because it's sort of they already had something that was similar enough, or they didn't think it would get enough work. But they were kind enough to sort of say, but it has potential. I think if you do this, 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 maybe we'll give it another look. And they did, and eventually I got on the roster, and it helped a lot. It helped a huge amount for my education purpose. Eventually, I started to outgrow it because a lot of my work came through word of mouth. And eventually, with schools and a lot of work that happens with kids, it does come by word of mouth. Parents trust other parents. And so when people had seen the program, thought it was good, they would talk it up to their friends. And then, so eventually I got to the point where it sort of didn't make sense for me personally. But yeah, I think those rosters are a great place to start, and they will help you figure it out.
That's great.
I'm just seeing Chris. There's some comments here from Krista
Yeah.
Cole.
Do you want to dig into those?
Yeah, did I apply to any NBC, Disney, or other writing programs to adapt kids' music, make pitches to studio networks? Great question. I have done very little with television, and really don't know how to break into that world. I would welcome it, although I have gotten probably more and more. I have zoned myself into. I'm not sure Disney would have any interest in me. I am sure that they would not, but PBS might even start to find me difficult. But I think I do know in the general kids music world there are people who make that the transition. Lori Berkner is somebody who's spent a lot of time on PBS, I think, or one of the kids stations. A guy I know better, Steve Songs, became the PBS. Did those interstitials on PBS in America in between sort of Sesame Street and the other stuff. They're very good-looking people. I'll say one of the things I realized early on is that I don't have a face for television. So Krista, I wish you the good look and charm that you may need for television that I don't possess. But even if you don't have it, I think there's a whole world there. That's one of the things about children's music is it's actually very diverse. Even though in some ways it feels small, in other ways it feels like there are much broader possibilities than there are in where I came from in the folk music world. Because there's children's television workshop, there is children's television, there is music that's being made in those places as well. So I think one of the things I've learned over the years is that there's a lot of ways to do children's music, and there's overlap between these different scenes, but they are sort of separate. So the thing that has been singularly most helpful for me as I was trying to figure this out was to do the thing that I like to do least, which is go to these conferences. To me, it's like poison. I feel like a fish out of water, but I learned a ton. And you meet people, and you may feel like, I didn't, meet the people I wanted to meet, but you get to know the community, and that will teach you everything. It'll teach you what people are doing. It'll teach you sort of who the people you don't know are. So I've had to fight my own instincts over and over again, including going to seeing that roster, see their showcase, because my instinct's always been like, I have an idea, I'll jump in, I'll just go do it. And often I shoot myself in the foot with that because I don't know what other people are doing or what's wanted or needed or how I can fit in. So I think being more studious about it, spending some time paying attention, whatever the field is, if it's television you're interested in, then do an internship, talk to people. I did a bunch of this. This is one thing I did well, was I took people out to coffee. it's one thing I got right. I did it in folk music first, and then I did it in children's music. So when I came to Boston, after a couple of years of banging around on the open mics, I asked Ellis Powell to go have coffee with me, and he did. He was very kind, and he did. And then I asked Jim Infantino of Jim's Big Ego, and he did. And when I got into children's music, I did the same. I asked Vanessa Trian, who's here in Boston, and Ben Rudnick, and some other people, and they were kind enough to let me pick their brains. And I think most people are like that, in these fields. It's a pretty welcoming group, and I've spent a lot of time doing that for people now too, and I think it definitely helps to get a lay of the land.
Mm-hmm. I have one final question for you.
Sure.
What would you recommend? What should people avoid? What mistakes have you made? And you've mentioned being too prescriptive early on in your ideas about kids' music. But give me your top 3 or top 5 like mistakes and things you should avoid, that kind of thing.
Well, I think I'll turn that around. Thinking back, I've talked a lot about the mistakes that I've made along the way. There are things that I would have figured out a lot sooner if I was less bullheaded about. So having a better demeanor going into it than I had is a good starting place. But
what do you mean by better? Just more open-minded?
More open-minded, more willing to sort of stand in the spotlight of other people's success and observe, without feeling like I want to be on stage, or, go watch, go listen, pay attention, ask different people, don't just talk to people who look like you and who write the same kind of music that you write. Ask other people, see where they're at. But one thing that I've learned this year, and it kind of will circle back, I guess, to some of this stuff about diversity, equity that we've talked about, is that making mistakes is essential to life, but also to music, and the business of music. And you're going to make a lot of mistakes. Don't let them own you. Expect and accept that you're going to fuck up and embrace that. Allow yourself to be criticized, allow yourself to be open to correction, to learn, decide sometimes, they don't know what they're talking about. But listen first. When Pete Seeger sent me this letter 10 years ago saying no, 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 it hurt. And I thought, I don't know what I'm doing. I shouldn't be doing stuff for kids. This is my hero. And he's telling me I'm off base. It took me years to look back at that letter and realize in between all of his tough Puritan instincts, and he was a tough old bird, was a whole lot of love that he was willing to engage at all, that he thought it was important enough to redirect me. And if I had been better at making mistakes back then, I would have been able to hear that and internalize it and put my own emotions aside to evaluate what he had to say. But it took a long time to get my ego out of the way, to go look back at that letter and say, he was teaching me stuff here. Mm-hmm. And I wish I had paid attention sooner.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can we get another song from you?
Sure.
Would that be possible?
Yeah. Why not? I'll do the...
You've also spoken for an hour without taking a drink of water, which I'm starting to marvel at.
That's because I didn't think to bring water. I did bring a little wine.
That's great.
This is the title song of the Be a Pain album. If you see something that's wrong, raise your hand and say that's wrong. Point it out and name that thing by its name. Don't stand by and stare. If it's wrong, it's your affair. Don't be quiet. make a riot, be a pain. Be a pain, be a pain, shout about it and complain. Ignore the crowd and go against the grain. Don't be polite, raise your voice, do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. When Rosa Parks sat on that bus, she chose to make a fuss. She chose to break the rules and take the blame. Her choice to sit and fight helped to bring on civil rights, because one strong woman chose to be a pain. Be a pain, be a pain, shout about it and complain. If they say you have to move, say I'll remain. Don't be polite, raise your voice, do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. Harvey Milk chose to run for the council board and won, even though folks said you can't because you're gay. One brave LGBTQ elected leader ran and knew you can change things if you choose to be a pain. Be a pain, be a pain, shout about it and complain. Tell him I won't let you make me feel ashamed. Don't be polite, raise your voice, do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. A tennis star named Billie Jean told the world she had a dream that men and women would be paid the same. She refused to hit that ball till there was equal pay for all. She was a king because she was a royal pain. Be a pain, be a pain, shout about it and complain. If they refuse to pay, refuse to play the game. Don't be polite, raise your voice, do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. One more. Kids from Parkland led the fight for something they all knew was right. They said it's time for us to finally make a change. If adults can't compromise, we must go march for our lives. They spoke out and led the charge. They all were pains. Be a pain, shout about it and complain. If you're faced with laws you know are just insane. Don't be polite, raise your voice and do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain.
Fantastic. I can imagine as you were singing, I was imagining a lot of parents covering their kids' ears. Like, we don't want our kid to be more of a pain, you know. It's a different kind of pain for sure. Please, everyone in the chat, throw in some compliments and comments. Show your love for this man. I think we've come to the end of the questions. So thank you so much for your time and for your wisdom. That was a lot to unpack, and I think certainly for me, you know, my impression of family music has expanded over the last hour. That's probably true for a lot of people. You know, they probably think of it as one small box, and it's a lot bigger than that, I think. So
I think that's right, and I think for those of you who are interested in entering this field, you can continue to make it bigger. That's been one of my goals, and I think it's something that we're seeing more and more of. You know, is that people step into this space and, you know, change the boundaries of what can be children's music. What does that look like? What does it sound like? So come on in. We need the water's warm, and we need more interesting, creative young people.
And be a pain.
And be a pain.
Alastair, thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure. It's been fantastic.
Thanks for having me. This was really fun.
Yeah, have a great night, and good luck for the end of the pandemic, and I hope you have a great end of year and your career picks up where it left off and all that stuff. So
thank you, sir. You too, Murray.
Cheers, man. We'll talk soon. Yeah. Alastair Moock, that was amazing. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. What a wise, smart person he is. That was great to listen to. So this is the Business of Music series. We try to do it once a month. Sign up to our newsletter. So go on our website, which is torontosongwritingschool.com. Sign up to our newsletter, and then you will be hip to all of the upcoming events. Hip is a word that apparently the kids use these days. So sign up to the newsletter. We have classes as well. We have a beginner and intermediate class starting in early June 2nd and 3rd, I believe. There's a class for every level. We have lyric writing classes once a month, and we are hoping and praying that by the end of the year, perhaps this fall, we will do a songwriters getaway somewhere in Ontario. And so we're waiting for the stars to align for that. But again, that'll all be in the newsletter. So go to our website, sign up, and you will be hip to everything. I think that is it. Thanks all of you for tuning in, and we will see you hopefully next month for another one of these. So have a great evening, and we'll see you soon.